Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 293 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Today's episode deals with one of the most notorious political assassinations in history, the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. It's the story of two friends who became bitter enemies in a struggle between church and state that drew in some of the most powerful people from all over medieval Europe. So, how is it that a pretty ordinary kid from London ended up as England's most famous saint? This week, I spoke with Dr. Michael Staunton about the life of Thomas Becket. Michael is a professor in the School of History at University College Dublin, and the author and editor of several works on St. Thomas, including The Lives of Thomas Becket, Thomas Becket and His Biographers, and The Historians of Angevin, England. His new book is Thomas Becket and His World. Our conversation on Thomas's rapid rise to the highest positions in England, his epic feud with Henry II, including what part Henry might have played in Thomas's martyrdom, and the aftermath of the infamous murder in the cathedral, is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Michael, to talk about Thomas Becket. This is an exciting topic. It's always interesting, no matter how many times you hear this story. And so I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Danièle. It's very nice to be here.
So we were just talking off air about why would you retell this story again at this moment? So what was it that spoke to you that made you feel like, I need to tell this story?
I mean, this is a story that has been told over and over again since Thomas Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral in December 1170. It's been told in different ways, but the reason why I wanted to tell it in this book, why it's called Thomas Becket and His World, is because I thought that this is a story that tells us a great deal, not just about a fascinating individual, Thomas himself, but it tells you about the world he was born into, the world of London, the social life of London at the time. It tells us about the world of the Kingdom of England at a very important time in the 12th century when the English crown is becoming a very powerful force. It tells us about the church, and it tells us about some of the maybe surprising aspects of the church at this time, how there's a lot of conflict within the church that Thomas Becket felt. It tells us about things like sainthood. Thomas is hailed as the greatest saint of his age. There are countless miracles recorded of Thomas. And it also tells us about storytelling, because while Thomas was alive, people started to try to shape his image. You had a counter image being presented. And then after his death, people started to go back through this life and say, well, what does this all mean? And as well as that, Thomas is the person in England of the Middle Ages who had most written about him in the Middle Ages. We have these massive tomes of letters that were collected as he was living, and then other letters reflecting on his death. We have a very large number of biographies, often written by people who he knew, who witnessed his murder. So that's the kind of opportunity that you don't have for most medieval figures.
Well, that's what I was just thinking, is that most of the people I speak to on this podcast are like, well, we have to make some guesses because there's no records about this particular person. And I think in your book, you mentioned that there are something like 10 biographies of Becket shortly after he's murdered, and 5 of them are by eyewitnesses. Like, this is unprecedented.
Yeah, it's an amazing opportunity. And, a number of these writers actually say, I was there at the murder. I admit I hid behind an altar when I was witnessing all of this. One of his biographers held up his arm and blocked one of the assailant's blows, and actually nearly had his arm cut off on that account. And he wrote an account of Thomas. And we know a great amount of the facts of Thomas's life. We have those in sometimes day by day, hour by hour detail. Part of the reason why people continue to write about him, and people still do to this day, is that people had different ways of making sense of it all. On the one hand, was he a saint? Was he a heroic figure? Or was he somebody who is simply a traitor to the king? How can we explain somebody who is so controversial during his lifetime being hailed as the greatest saint that England has ever had? And that's part of the reasons why people wrote in the 1170s. And it's also just being drawn by the fascination of the subject. They really believed that they had witnessed one of the most important events in history. And it wasn't just the fact that these 10 biographies were written shortly after his murder. This, in a way, stimulated a revival of historical writing in England. A lot of other people started writing about their own times, about recent events, about sequels to Becket's Martyrdom, rebellions against the king, and so on. So it was the excitement of the event, the complexity of the individual. That's what drove people to write about it.
Yes, I mean, you're really selling it. So we're going to have to get into this soon. But you're absolutely right. I think that you're not overselling it in that this was just a monumental time. And I think that it is reflected in that writing. I hadn't thought about that being sort of a stimulus to write more, but I think you're absolutely right about that. Okay, so one of the things that people find fascinating about Becket is he wasn't born into the nobility. So let's start at the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Thomas.
There was a boy named Thomas, and he was born in London, either 1118 or 1120, we're not quite sure. He was born right in the centre of what is now called the City of London. So that's the historic medieval centre of London. If you go to London today, you'll see a little plaque on the street Cheapside, which shows where Thomas was born. So right in the heart of the City of London. His father was a merchant named Gilbert. And he and his mother, Matilda, they had come over from Normandy. They were born in Normandy. So this is, of course, after the conquest of England by William, Duke of Normandy. You start to get various people coming over to England, merchants from Normandy coming over and settling in London. So his parents were actually fairly well off, but he didn't come from the nobility. And this is what set him apart amongst a lot of the people that he was mixing with. And it was something that was always held against him. He was always reminded of this throughout his life. And you could say it explains a number of his behaviors later on. Also, when he was killed and when he became this great saint, people started to try to explain this. How could he have been this great figure and come from such a relatively humble background? So there actually developed a legend that his father was a crusader who had been captured in the Holy Land, and a Saracen princess had saved him from captivity and later followed him to England. And this was Gilbert and Matilda, which you mightn't think was a typical name from the Holy Land, but that was the myth. And the reason why this story was told was so that they could explain he must have had some kind of royal blood for him to be this great. He must have been the daughter of a princess. And none of that is true, unfortunately, but it shows us this kind of preoccupation. So on the one hand, Thomas is unusual in coming from this non-noble background, but he's also actually illustrates something of the time. This was a time when people from his background could actually climb their way up the social rank, as he did, because of new opportunities that existed in England at this time. So the ways that you could do this, I mean, the main way was through education. And after a schooling locally in London and just outside London, he went to Paris and he was educated in Paris. It was a very exciting time, the aftermath of Abelard and Eloise, what people call the 12th century Renaissance starting to flourish in Paris. None of that seems to have affected Thomas. And he actually dropped out of college after a year and he came back to London. And one of his biographers says, he actually spent the next year doing nothing. And his father's prospects were declining. His business was declining. He'd suffered from a number of fires in London. His mother died. He seems to have had some kind of a crisis. But he eventually gets a job and he's an accountant. He's an assistant to a financier in the City of London. And here you can see London in the 12th century is developing as a really important commercial centre. And Thomas is part of this. But his real break comes when he's introduced to Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. And this is a really good example of the sort of social climbing commoner. Usually these people had a better education than Thomas had. Usually they would have completed their degree. Thomas had other compensations. He was clearly very clever. He was able to do practical tasks. He was also literate. He was numerate. And these were the kinds of people who were sought by bishops, archbishops, kings, nobles at this time, a time when writing was becoming more important in administering, whether it was a kingdom or whether it was in church administration. So he finds himself in the household of Archbishop Theobald working for him. And that is his real break. It introduces him to a world that he had not seen before. It allows him to mix with people of noble background and allows him to mix with a lot of people who are important at that time, and also to get to know other young men who would go on to be very important figures later on.
Yes, I think we can recognize this sort of figure throughout history, right? The person who finds themselves in the circles with all the high rollers and starts to get a taste for that life and starts to quite enjoy that life. But nobody expected him to rise to the top of power, especially because he doesn't cut a glamorous figure from what we've seen in the accounts of his life, right? I think that a few people mentioned that he might have had a stutter, that he wasn't particularly good looking. No one was expecting him to really rise to the top.
Yeah, there's a description of him, there's a couple of descriptions of him from this time. And what they say about him is, and they praise him and they say, he had long, elegant fingers. They say that he had a very good sense of smell, things like that. But these kinds of qualities are not really the things that absolutely set somebody apart. I mean, they talk about the potential that he showed at that time. But it took a while to be realized. And it was really the first time it was properly realized was when he got involved in helping the Archbishop in political negotiations, when he began to be sent off on business, on embassies, and so on. And it was through this that he came to meet Henry II, who would become the other great figure in his life. And this is where you really see the potential developing. So
Yes,
maybe I should say a little bit about that, about Henry II, and because he's such a crucial figure in all of this.
that's what I'm thinking. He's the perfect contrast in that Henry is so glamorous that everyone expects him to succeed at everything, right? So
Yeah,
tell us
yeah.
about Henry.
So Henry was younger than Thomas, and Henry II was the grandson of Henry I. Henry I died in the year 1135, and he had designated his daughter, Matilda, Henry II's mother, to be his successor. As it turned out, this was disputed. It was disputed by Stephen, who became King Stephen. So the period 1135 to 1154 was the reign of King Stephen, but it was a disputed reign. It was disputed by Matilda, who insisted that she was the rightful heir to the throne. She nearly became ruler of England, but it didn't quite happen. The important thing from the point of view of Thomas and Henry II is that Henry grew up with this sense of grievance that he had had the throne taken away from him. He invaded England at the age of 14, and he was this very capable figure. You can see this throughout his life. Not everybody approved of Henry II, not everybody liked him, but they were all impressed by him. He was a very impressive, lively, vigorous, capable figure. He probably got to know Thomas shortly before he became king, because by 1153, it was clear that the throne could not really be handed over to Stephen's son. It had to go to Henry. Henry Plantagenet, as well as being the son of Matilda, he's the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet. And this was all arranged with various senior figures within the church negotiating it, and Thomas is likely to have been one of those. So Henry becomes king in 1154. He's relatively new to England. He's grown up in Anjou and in Normandy, only spent a certain amount of his earlier life in England. He needs to choose new people. And Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, recommends to him Thomas, his trusty clerk, would be an excellent figure as Chancellor of the realm.
Which is a massive position, especially for somebody who has not reached a venerable age. He's still
Yeah,
quite young, and he gets
yeah.
to be chancellor. So what is this position like? What is it all about?
So the chancellor it's an important position because the chancellor runs the writing office. And this is one of the things that runs through the life of Henry II and Thomas Becket and this period in English history, the growing importance of writing. It's still the case that a king rules by charisma. It's still the case that a king rules by physical power. But a king is increasingly, and especially in England, is increasingly ruling through writing, being able to communicate with his servants, being able to use writing to give grants to people, to organize his finances, all of these things. So the chancellor is the head of the writing office. He had various other responsibilities as well. So it's a position that was always important. It's more important now. But the real importance of Thomas Becket as chancellor is the bond that he had with Henry. And it seems that they immediately hit it off. They got on extremely well. Thomas worked very effectively in bringing about a new policy of reform in the kingdom. Henry's intention is to go back to 1135 when his grandfather, Henry I, was king. He wants to turn back the clock to that time. He wants to have law and order. He wants to have strong kingship, all of this. Thomas is his right hand man. And as well as that, Thomas is somebody who takes a new delight in the aristocratic lifestyle, the kind of lifestyle that he had not grown up in, but he takes to it like a duck to water. So, he's described as taking an interest in hunting, in feasting. He wears elegant clothes. He has a pet wolf. And this is all the time he's actually in clerical orders. He's a clerk in the Middle Ages. The term in Latin, clericus, it means both somebody who writes, like a clerk, that sort of clerk, and it also means somebody who's a cleric. So he is in religious orders, but he's leading a very secular life, and he's really taken to this once he gets to know Henry II. And so part of his importance in this political position is because, as one of his biographers says, there were never in Christian times two better friends than these two men.
Yes, it's incredible. And when you think about it sort of in human terms, there's Henry who's completely traumatized by his entire childhood of being felt like he's shoved to the side and really wanting all that law and order. And then you have Thomas, who's sort of like wide-eyed in some ways, coming to the court and getting to know all these great ways of living that are fabulous beyond what he could ever have imagined for himself before. And one of the things that I think is important that we remark on before we take our next step into the story is that Thomas stepped back from the priesthood in that he was educated in the church, he went to university, but he never took the step of becoming a priest. So he's not Henry's confessor or anything. They're just besties who
Yeah.
bond over the law. And I think
Yeah.
that's important because you would imagine, given the next parts of his story, that he would be a priest at this point, but he's not. And that's deliberate on his part.
That's right. And he does a lot of things that are very, let's say, unpriest-like. So, for example, he fights in battle. Henry II rules over not just England, he rules lands from the Pyrenees to the North Sea. And part of this is inheritance through his mother and his father. Part of it is because of his marriage to one of the most famous women of the time, Eleanor of Aquitaine. When he marries Eleanor, he inherits vast lands in southern France. So he's ruling over nearly half of France. So a lot of what Thomas does is, in part, he's looking after the kingdom when Henry is across the sea, but he's also getting engaged in, for example, a campaign in Toulouse, the south of France, where he is actually fighting on horseback and apparently knocks a very valiant knight off his horse during the aftermath of this campaign. He's described as being particularly gung-ho in this campaign, urging Henry on to, capture the city of Toulouse. He goes off on an embassy to Paris, which is described in great detail, where he is trying to arrange a marriage between the children of Henry II and King Louis of France. And this account says that he traveled along with something like 6 horse-drawn carriages. One of those carriages carried only ale. One of them carried just changes of fine clothing. On every horse, there was a monkey sitting on top of it. You have all of this kind of sense of very lavish lifestyle, a very secular lifestyle, the most secular kind of lifestyle you could imagine. Though later on, some of his biographers would say, well, he still retained a religious spirit, but they weren't really able to produce a lot of evidence of that.
I mean, it doesn't seem very clear. And again, it doesn't seem like that was his aim ever at this point, was to be, austere in any way. So Henry has brought Becket into his friendship, into his orbit, in part because of his knowledge of the law. And so I think we need to explain why Henry is so intent on not only understanding his own law, but having somebody church trained at his side when it comes to his ideas of reforming the law, because this is kind of the crux of the matter here.
Yeah, so as I said, Henry II, his real ambition when he comes to the throne is to turn back the clock to 1135. But in order to do that, you have to make a lot of changes. And he tries, first of all, dealing with various nobles who stood up to him. And he does that quite easily. He cows them into submission. Also in his early years, it's described how Thomas and Henry collaborate in bringing back law and order to the kingdom. So he's interested in bringing order. And this is something that a lot of people wanted after the civil war of the previous years. He's also using law in other ways. This is the beginnings of the English common law, and it's one of the major important events or developments of this period. So it was always the case that you could appeal to the king over a matter of law. But in practice, you couldn't do that. You had to actually encounter the king. The king would have to be passing by, or you would have to go to Westminster and find the king or some of his justices there. So Henry II, he establishes traveling justices who go from place to place. He establishes various mechanisms which will allow people access to the law. And this isn't just out of the generosity of Henry's heart. It's also because it allows him to, he takes money from various cases. It retains a certain control over his kingdom that wouldn't have existed otherwise. So he's brought about all of these reforms in relation to most aspects of society. The one area that he has not attempted to do this is with the church. And the reason is that you have Archbishop Theobald, who's now very old. They're waiting for him to die. And then when he dies, he thinks, I'll be able to reform this. And the kinds of things he wants to deal with there are also abuses, as he sees it, that have developed during the reign of his predecessor, King Stephen. So, for example, one is the fact that bishops, monks, abbots had started to appeal over the head of the king to the Pope. Now, that was really not necessarily Stephen's fault. The papacy was developing its own jurisdiction. It was expanding its reach in various ways. So much of the Becket dispute, it's a clash between these two expanding powers, expanding jurisdiction, the monarchy, the papacy, both wanting to exploit the rights that they have. You also have, this might be a surprising sort of thing, but there was a great concern in Henry's mind and among some of the people around him that part of the reason for criminality was that church courts were being too lenient on churchmen who committed serious crimes. So you have a lot of people like Thomas who are in religious orders. They're clerks. They're not necessarily leading a terribly religious life. But if they're charged with a serious crime, like murder, they can go to a church court, they can maybe swear an oath, and then be allowed to go free. So this was a central issue that Henry wanted to deal with. So these are the kind of technical issues that become central to the Becket dispute, but really the bigger issue is about the king saying the church has gained too much freedom in relation to rights that should be mine. And on the other hand, you have people within the church saying, there's a principle here. The church has its own liberty, and that this is tyrannical oppression of the church.
Right. And so Thomas doesn't feel like this is going to be important to him very much at all, right? He's helping Henry. The archbishop is in place, but the archbishop dies. And still, I don't think Thomas was thinking, I'm going to be the next archbishop. But this is what happens.
Yeah, and there's a couple of descriptions of it that say that when Thomas heard the news that he was going to be made archbishop, he was playing chess and he was wearing some kind of outfit that had long ornaments hanging from the sleeves. And he said, he looked down at his clothes and he said, "Me? Really? Is this the sort of person that you want to appoint to the most important position in the church in England, Archbishop of Canterbury?" Now, how true that is, we don't know. Thomas must have had an inkling that he was going to be in line for this, or certainly that he was a strong candidate. Clearly, Henry believed that Thomas was the person who would lead his reforms. He came from the church, he had familiarity with various people within the church. Canterbury, in particular, in a way, was returning home to Canterbury. But he wasn't, not saying that he was irreligious, there's no sign of that, but he wasn't somebody who would have seemed to Henry to be a champion of the church in the future. Very little, if any, sign of that. And that's what made the transformation on becoming archbishop so striking.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. You can't say, well, I can't say that this was Thomas's plan all along, because you would think that he would be ordained, that he'd be looking for positions as a bishop or lower positions, maneuvering his way to the archbishopric. But this isn't what he does. And yet he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, and there is a transformation. He starts to think about what his role is here. So tell us a little bit about how this transformation happens within Thomas. And it's pretty much universally acknowledged that there is a turning point right here, right?
Yeah, I think everybody agrees that something happened. But what exactly did happen? That's the real question. And of course, we're dealing mainly with people who are writing in retrospect after his murder. And they're trying to explain this. And they're trying to say, how can we fit together this worldly chancellor and this champion of the church and later saint? And what they say, and there's no contemporary evidence of this, nobody's writing about this at the time it happens or even in the year or so afterwards. They say that when he was consecrated, so as you said, he wasn't a priest, he became priest a day before he became archbishop. So he becomes archbishop, and they say once he was consecrated, he experienced this remarkable transformation. He was touched by the hand of God. They use all of this biblical imagery about it. And they say that this manifested itself, first of all, in his way of life, that he retained the sort of formal clothing of the archbishop, but beneath that, he started to wear a monastic habit. And beneath that again, he started to wear a hair shirt. So that is, brittle kind of shirt that cut into his skin. The kind of thing that hermits would wear in order to mortify the flesh. And they say that on the outside, he looked like, as you would expect, he conformed. But within, everything was different. And they actually say that even better than this, one of the really distinguishing things about this was that he deliberately kept it secret. Out of humility, he didn't want to show it to anybody else. This is an impossible claim to refute. It was amazing, but nobody could see it. So people later draw on, they say, well, his confessor said this, or there's a story about how one of his attendants said, basically, you're looking very fat, Thomas. And he said, well, yeah, maybe I am. And what he didn't realize is that he was all bulked up because of the hair shirt and the monastic habit. So that's how it was rationalized. But whatever happened within, we can certainly see that he started to behave differently as regards Henry II and as regards himself, positioning himself in a different way. And the dispute with Henry didn't happen immediately. It was gradual. First of all, it seems that Henry had wanted him to continue as chancellor, even as archbishop, but he resigned that office. And then you start to have various little skirmishes. It might be over matters of taxation, for example, or Thomas might have excommunicated one of the king's noblemen for doing something against Canterbury. So you have these little skirmishes, but then matters come to a head when Henry tries to push through his reform program. So he starts to ask Thomas and the other bishops if they will agree to what he calls the customs of the realm, the customs of the kingdom, or my ancestral customs. So what he's talking about here is that the rights of the king as regards the church should be the same now as they were in the year 1135 when his grandfather died. He says that explicitly. And Thomas and the rest of the churchmen say no. There's nothing that surprising about this, in that most churchmen are going to say, at least let's negotiate. We're not going to simply acknowledge this reform, which is actually quite radical, to turn back the clock in this way. But it's the way that Thomas did it that really caused the problems. There are a series of meetings. Matters get more bitter between Henry and Thomas. And eventually, Henry demands that Thomas agrees to these customs. These customs are things like, for example, a clerk who is convicted of a serious crime has to be handed over from the church court to the royal court. Or it might be things like you can't appeal to the Pope's jurisdiction without first passing this by the king. Or you can't just go into exile and, say, visit the Pope or leave the kingdom for any reason without having the permission of the king. Thomas is pressured by various people within the church. And it's not that these people within the church, other bishops, for example, the Bishop of London, it's not that he wanted to sell out the rights of the church to the king. It was more the sense that this isn't really all that important. Just say yes. Just say that you'll acknowledge the customs. It doesn't really mean anything. We've had assurances that he's not really going to go through with this. He just wants his honour to be recognised. So Thomas agrees. And it's at this meeting at Clarendon, a meeting with all of the bishops and the nobles of the kingdom. And then Henry says, okay, you've agreed. Now I'm going to ask for these customs to be put down in writing. And he presents them to Thomas. And at this point, Thomas says, no, I can't accept these being put in writing. Again, it's this theme that runs through so much of it about how at this time, writing is becoming an extremely important technology. It's something that can be used to advance the rights of a king, the rights of an archbishop. It's something that is part of the discussion as it wasn't before. And England is at the cutting edge of this. So from this point on, the king and the archbishop are pretty much estranged. And it leads to Thomas being summoned to trial at Northampton in October 1164. And this again is a major occasion. The bishops, the nobles, the king, all of their attendants, huge numbers of people converging. And really, it's an excuse for Henry II to pressure Thomas to resign his office. It's perfectly clear that they don't have a working relationship. They're not talking to each other. Henry and the people around him think this is the way we'll pressure him to resign. And they drag up various charges against him. For example, that he'd embezzled money when he was chancellor. And eventually, after a few days of this, Thomas is in a very defensive position. It looks like he's going to be, he'll have to resign or he'll be convicted, he'll be imprisoned maybe. And then one morning he gets up and, according to his biographers, he's changed in a way. He decides to take a different approach. The first thing he does is he goes and he says Mass. There's nothing unusual for an Archbishop of Canterbury to do that. But the Mass that he said was not the Mass of that particular day. Instead, he had chosen to say the Mass of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And the liturgy of this Mass is all about the persecution of the martyrs by the secular powers. Kings and princes have stood and spoken against me. And then Thomas comes into the chamber, the trial chamber. As he's on his way, his cross-bearer, as is customary, is carrying his cross before him. Thomas grabs it out of his arms and walks into the chamber carrying the cross. There's a scuffle. Some of the other bishops try to drag the cross from him. The Bishop of London said he was always a fool and he always will be. And what he's doing here is he's raising these issues to a new level. Instead of it just being about the matters of embezzling money, instead of it just being even about the royal customs, about the rights of the crown as against the church, he's saying, I'm fighting for good against evil. I'm fighting for God, and I'm fighting against a tyrant. And this is the real transformation. You have not just a transformation of Thomas himself, whatever that meant, a personal transformation, a political transformation, but now the dispute has become something that transcends just these individuals and just these particular issues.
Yes, he draws a line in the sand and there is no going back from there. Even though they try a couple of times to reconcile, the writing is on the wall at this point. So in the interest of time, I'm going to have to fast forward us a little bit. So Thomas ends up in exile for quite a long time, but he's convinced to come back to Canterbury, and everybody has a bad feeling about this, but he's back in Canterbury around the Christmas season. What happens? What happens here? Because there is some drama when people talk about this, like Henry II exclaims something and then it all goes to hell, as they say.
Yeah. So as you say, he's away in exile for more than 6 years. And during that time, the dispute gets more and more bitter. The various sides have their weapons. Thomas now gains from the Pope the right of excommunication and suspension of people. And that's something that he uses from time to time. Finally, they patch up a peace. And in the year 1170, as you say, Thomas is ready to go home to Canterbury to be restored as Archbishop of Canterbury. The last thing he does before he sails to England is that he sends ahead of him a letter, and this letter excommunicates a number of his enemies within the church, or suspends them from office. And this is the last straw, as far as these people and as far as Henry II goes. These bishops make their way to King Henry, who is in Normandy at this time, and they complain about what Thomas has done. And Henry is noted for being an angry king. There's a story about him when somebody said something about the King of Scotland. Isn't the King of Scotland a great warrior? Henry got so angry that he rolled on the ground and started chewing his mattress. So he had this explosive temper. The famous words that people quote are, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" or "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" That's not recorded by any contemporaries. What they say is that he says something like this: "This low-born clerk who came to my court penniless with a limping mule, and I gave him everything. I raised him up from nothing to this position, and now he lifts up his heel and he kicks me in the teeth." And he says, even worse than this are these drones, all of you, drones who do nothing to avenge me. And this was the cue for 4 knights to set out and decide that they would take revenge on the king's behalf against Thomas.
So I have to ask you, do you think that was what Henry intended?
I don't think it was what he intended. And in fact, there's a certain amount of evidence that people were sent in pursuit of these knights to bring them back. It should also be said, the intentions of the knights aren't entirely clear either. So the image that, if you've ever seen an image of Thomas Becket, it shows the knights in full armor, piling on with their swords in Canterbury Cathedral. And that's how it all happened. But did they plan to do that? Probably not. It seems, going by the accounts, that what they wanted to do was to arrest Thomas. They wanted to arrest him, and they wanted to bring him across the sea to Henry to face trial. Now, that's bad enough in itself. The intention doesn't necessarily seem to have been to kill Thomas. But if you come in to a cathedral wielding swords in full armor, there's a danger that these kinds of things can happen. And that's what happened. So the accounts tell us, and as I've said at the start, many of these accounts are eyewitness accounts. They're very, very detailed. And they tell us more or less the same story, that the knights come to the Archbishop's palace. They challenge him. They say, "Come with us. We want to take you back to the king. You're a disgrace the way you've broken the peace," all of this. They go out then to arm themselves, and Thomas is dragged into the cathedral by various monks. The cathedral, of course, is the sanctuary. That is the place where he is supposed to be safe, particularly when you're talking about the Church of Canterbury, Canterbury Cathedral, the centre, the holiest place in English Christendom, and the leader of the church. So he's dragged in. It's the 29th of December, 1170. It's the afternoon, so it's getting dark, it's cold, all of that. The monks are singing vespers. There's certain local people there as well. Thomas is dragged into the cathedral, and then they start to hear the noise of doors being cut down. They've locked the door outside. The knights manage to burst in. So they burst in. They're dressed in full armor. All you can see is their eyes. They're holding their swords, and they shout out, "Where is Becket, traitor to the king?" The very fact that they call him Becket is going back to his early roots. It's just, you're just Becket, you're just the Londoner, the merchant's son. And they approach him. There's a bit of a argument between them. Thomas says, "I'm no traitor, I'm simply being loyal to God," and so on. What exactly happened next is not quite clear. In one account, one of the knights tries to drag him by his cloak and says, "We're taking you out of the church. We're going to bring you to the king." And he actually knocks the knight over. Certainly, it seems that there was a little bit of a struggle, and then one of the knights strikes at him. The others start to strike as well. And in a short time, he's lying dead on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. So it's this incredibly shocking murder, and shocking for a number of reasons. First of all, because of who he is. He's one of the most famous people in the Christian world. Of course, he became even more famous after that, but he was a major figure in the ecclesiastical, in the political world of the time when he was killed. And it was also the place where it happened and the violence of it. If you read the accounts of it, the violence is really striking. And this changed everything. Now the person who had been unpopular amongst many of the other figures within the church, who had been detested by many of Henry II's people, he was now hailed as a saint. And not just a saint, but the greatest saint of his era.
Well, I mean, it's hard not to give him that title when he is in, as you say, the holiest place. He's the holiest guy, and he seems to be standing up for God. He's got the Pope on his side, and yet these men will come in. And in case people, because I think sometimes people are like, was it an accidental killing? Were people just waving swords around and something bad happened? But I didn't realize until reading your book that in the aftermath, Thomas is lying on the floor of the cathedral, and a knight actually pokes the wound to make sure that he's dead. It's like, this is absolutely gruesome and appalling in all senses of the word, not only from our modern perspective where the murder is bad, but like all the medieval context around this as well.
Yeah. One of the writers quotes somebody who was there, says that the knights said to each other, one said to another, "This fellow won't get up again. He's dead." And then they went out of the church and then rode out to Canterbury shouting, "King's men, we're king's men," tying themselves to the king. It's not an act just of their own. Nor is it the case that sometimes you hear the idea that Thomas was looking to be killed, that he wanted to be a martyr. And he was accused during his lifetime of posing as a martyr, as, for example, bringing in the cross before him, saying the Mass of St. Stephen, all of this. But there's no evidence of that. You can see letters. We have letters saying, next Tuesday I'm going to do this kind of business, and Wednesday I'm going to do this. No sign that he wanted to sacrifice himself. But it is something very striking that even people who could be very critical of Thomas, and there's so much negative information there about so many of his motives that can be brought up. But the personal bravery at the end is absolutely clear. And he could have been taken out of the church, he could have been arrested, but he chose not to be. And that is one of the strange mysteries of the story. He's not somebody who you would have seen sacrificing himself for the church in this way.
Yes, absolutely. And the loyalty, I think, of the people around him, as you say, someone actually raising their hand sort of reflexively to keep a sword off of their friend, their leader. It's
Yeah.
just, yeah, it's a really dramatic moment. And I'm not saying that lightly, but this is a moment in which there are so many unexpected things happening that it is stunning all these years later.
Yeah. And the aftermath is equally surprising. So initially, when Thomas lay dead on the floor of the cathedral, he wasn't a saint. People were afraid. The monks were afraid that the knights would come back and maybe desecrate the body, take further actions against the monks. So what they did was they buried him very quickly. And according to contemporary accounts, when they were stripping the body to bury it, they discovered that he was wearing the monastic habit and a hair shirt underneath. And they turned to each other and said, "How could we have had any doubts about this man when we can now see what was within him?" Now, obviously, that's something that is after the event, and it's an interpretation. But you did also have immediately popular acclaim for Thomas amongst the ordinary people of Canterbury. And right from the start, you start to hear of, for example, a man who had been there in the church. He dips his clothing in the blood of Thomas. He brings it back to his wife, who's been paralyzed for some time. She dips it in her bath water and she's cured. You start to have all of these stories of, especially the poor. You have a lot about, say, children. You have a lot about women. It tells us a great deal about ordinary life at this time. These people who would come to Canterbury, they tell their stories about how they'd seen Thomas in a vision or they'd prayed to Thomas. Thomas had intervened. So gradually, this starts to spread beyond Canterbury and beyond the poor. The tide starts to turn against Henry, against the knights. They are sentenced to go off on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where apparently they died. Measures are taken against Henry himself. He has to do recompense. And Thomas is canonized within 2 years of his death, which is a remarkably fast time. But maybe the strangest thing about the aftermath, and one of the reasons why the cult of Thomas Becket as a saint continued to prosper, at least until the Reformation, is because the king, Henry II himself, decides to take the lead in promoting it. And how this happens is that, if you think of it, Henry II has been this incredibly vigorous, capable, successful king. He's had very few troubles, really, throughout his life as king, except for the clash with Thomas Becket. That has certainly been a headache in various ways. But this is the first time that Henry looks weak. This is the first time that people from all over the Christian world are outraged, attributing this murder to him ultimately. So he does an initial kind of penance, but still, people decide to take this as an opportunity to rise up against Henry. So Henry, just 3 years after the murder of Thomas, he faces a rebellion that involves his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, his sons, all of his sons, basically, the King of Scotland, the King of France, various other nobles. And he manages to fight back against this militarily, but really to gain victory over these people, he has to do something symbolic. So in the year 1174, he goes on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. He takes off his shoes when he arrives at the city. He walks barefoot. He's whipped in turn by each of the monks of Canterbury. He acknowledges his guilty role, if not the full role, full responsibility for the murder, and he spends the night at Thomas's tomb. The next morning, as he's leaving Canterbury, it turns out that his main enemy, still fighting against him, the King of Scotland, has been captured. So it seems that Thomas has given him the victory. So he's done penance to Thomas. Thomas has rewarded him. Now the king, his children, his family, they start to claim Thomas as their own. And they say he's our English saint. His daughters go off and marry various rulers in Germany, in Sicily, in Spain. They take veneration of St. Thomas with them. And he becomes this unifying figure, which again, nobody could have predicted.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of another instance where a king is down on his knees. He's being whipped by something like 80 monks over the course of the day. I can't think of another example of this performative humility. And I would imagine there is part of Henry, even if it is performance, that does feel bad about his friend for the longest time and how this all ended between them. But even then, whether he feels this or not, it is an absolutely remarkable event.
I agree. I think that when Henry heard the news of Thomas's murder, it said that he shut himself up in the room for days. And obviously he was aware of the political consequences of this, but I don't think that we can doubt that he was also upset for his former friend. In a way as well, it shows us what an impressive figure Henry is, or was, that he would take this kind of step, that he could see the power of public image. It's something that he and Thomas were always very conscious of throughout their dispute, and even when they were friends. And you see it especially now. It was a really genius stroke by Henry to take the name of Thomas as his forgiver, to associating himself again with Thomas. It must have taken a lot to show that humility, even if it was feigned humility, and it did work.
Yes. And for the record, Henry never did win that power over the church.
No, he didn't. He didn't. But in a way, nor did Thomas win. And in fact, some of those who wrote after, some of his strongest partisans, they said the problem is that everybody cares about Thomas the miracle worker. Everybody cares about this image of Thomas. Nobody cares about what he fought for anymore. And there was a certain kind of sense among his successors as archbishops of Canterbury and others within the church that we've been through those disputes. We don't want to keep fighting those battles again. But there is a sense that combination of Henry and others that they took the sting out of the dispute. So neither side really won, but neither side really lost either.
Yeah. I mean, when you consider what a watershed moment this was, you would think maybe that a tide would have been turned, but really it just was one of those moments in history that was absolutely huge. And then its impact had a ripple effect, like, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to the actual dispute, not much changed. So the whole story is fascinating, and we've gone longer than we usually do. And so I appreciate your time in explaining this so thoroughly and so well, because people hear about this incident, but when you really dig into it in the way that you have done in your book, and your book is just wonderful, I hope everyone will read it. It really sort of illustrates what a moment this was. So thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about it.
Thanks a lot, Danièle. I really enjoyed it.
To find out more about Michael's work, you can check out his faculty page at University College Dublin. His new book is Thomas Becket and His World. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So next week, I'm going to be at the Canadian Society of Medievalists, their annual conference. Yay. Mm-hmm. It's happening in Waterloo, not too far away from me in Toronto. So it's been years since I've attended one of these conferences, but there's a lot of friends and colleagues there. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, I hope to stop by and see a bunch of people as well, because it is a great bunch of people that we have here in Canada. And we actually have people from other places as well, not just Canadians, but part of the Canadian Society of Medievalists. And yeah, it's a great organization. Great to see.
Indeed, but they're even better if they're Canadians. So
sure. I'm not going to say that.
So anyways, I want a little shout out to the Dragon Lab at the University of Waterloo. That's DRAGEN. And it's a digital humanities space that's kind of run by Steve Bernardsky. I really love his work and stuff like that. And they run a whole bunch of projects related to archaeology and environment and like just medieval stuff. So just want to shout out to all the good work they're doing out there.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important to have people that are working on the front lines of the digital medieval stuff because, I mean, we really need this. This is the way that people are accessing it more and more these days.
Exactly. So while I'm at the conference, please enjoy what's on the website. This week, we have a wonderful piece by Veronica Minaldi, and she's looking at a 12th century tale and what it can tell us about learning and teaching for us today. So we have that plus 10 cities that fell into ruin during the Middle Ages.
Ooh, that could be interesting.
Yes. Yeah, we have lots of nice pictures of piles of rock.
I love piles of rock because there's so much scope for the imagination there, right?
Me too. I love a good pile of rock.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website, and I will see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you for supporting this podcast each week, whether it's by spreading the word, letting the ads play through, or becoming patrons on patreon.com. Without you, this podcast would not exist, so thank you. To find out how to become a patron and help me keep the medieval goodness coming, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from martyring to bartering, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist, and you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.